Judge Frank Caprio had already heard the whispers before the case was even called. They always arrived first. The low voices in the hallway, the careful glances from clerks, the way lawyers adjusted their posture when a particular name appeared on the docket. Experience had taught him that when a courtroom feels tense before anyone speaks, it's usually because someone believes the rules are flexible. That morning, the tension followed a woman seated in the first row, dressed with intention, confidence radiating from her posture rather than her words. Her name was Lauren Whitmore, and she wasn't there because of a misunderstanding. She was there because a quiet place meant for children had nearly become a crime scene. The incident itself had unfolded earlier in the week, during a school morning when parents assumed safety without thinking twice. Cars rolled forward in short bursts, crossing guards raised their hands, children laughed and complained about homework, unaware of how fragile routine can be. Lauren Whitmore drove into that space moving far too fast for comfort. Witnesses would later describe the moment not as chaos, but as shock, the kind that freezes people mid-step. A parent yanked a child backward just in time. A vehicle clipped a stopped bus. And then, instead of stopping, the driver continued on. By the time officers located Lauren a few blocks away, the danger had already passed, but the damage had not. The smell of alcohol answered questions before they were asked. Her speech lagged behind her thoughts. When an officer requested standard cooperation, she laughed and responded not with concern, but with confidence. She did not deny who she was. She emphasized it. She made it clear that she believed the situation would resolve itself once her identity was fully understood. That belief followed her all the way into the courtroom. Now seated before Judge Caprio, Lauren listened as the charges were read aloud. DUI, reckless endangerment, leaving the scene, interference. The words echoed, but her expression barely shifted. Her attorney attempted to frame the situation delicately: stress, misunderstanding, voluntary steps toward treatment. Judge Caprio allowed him to speak, then stopped him gently but firmly. He explained that stress does not excuse endangering children, and intention does not erase outcome. This court, he reminded everyone present, was not designed to protect reputations. When Judge Caprio addressed Lauren directly, he did not accuse her. He asked her whether she understood why she was there. Her response was measured, almost rehearsed. She suggested the situation had been inflated, that public attention had distorted the truth. Judge Caprio responded not with opinion, but with record, statements, footage, testimony. He allowed the evidence to speak, because evidence has no interest in status. As the footage played, the courtroom grew quiet. Parents sat motionless. Officers stood still. Lauren avoided the screen. A parent was invited to speak, not to accuse, but to explain. She described holding her child's hand, the sudden fear, the instinctive pull backward. She described the days afterward, the hesitation at crosswalks, the questions children ask when trust is broken. When Judge Caprio asked whether Lauren had reached out, the answer was simple: no. The judge turned back to Lauren and asked why. Her attorney answered instead, citing legal advice. Judge Caprio nodded, then said something that shifted the tone of the room. He said that legal caution may protect a case, but it does not heal harm. He said responsibility is something lawyers can file away. That was when Lauren Whitmore did something that no attorney had prepared for. She reached into her purse, slowly, calmly. She removed her phone and unlocked the screen. Judge Caprio noticed immediately and asked her what she was doing. Lauren did not hesitate. She said she was calling her husband. She said this had gone far enough, and she believed, truly believed, that this was the moment everything would stop.
The room did not erupt when Lauren Whitmore said she was calling her husband. It didn't need to. Silence arrived first, heavy, uncomfortable, unmistakable. Judge Frank Caprio didn't raise his voice or strike the gavel. He simply watched her for a moment longer than expected, the way someone watches a door close, knowing what's on the other side. Then he asked her a question so calm it felt almost merciful. Did she understand what she had just done? Lauren answered with frustration rather than fear. She said the hearing had crossed a line, that the scrutiny was excessive, that people were making an example out of her. Judge Caprio responded evenly, reminding her that the example had been created the moment children were put at risk, not when the case reached his courtroom. He instructed her to put the phone away. For a brief second, it looked like she might. Then she shook her head and said her husband deserved to know how she was being treated. The words landed poorly, not because they were loud, but because they revealed belief that authority lived outside the law and could be summoned when needed. Her attorney rose quickly, attempting to soften the moment, suggesting emotions were running high and that his client was overwhelmed. Judge Caprio stopped him with a raised hand. He explained that overwhelm does not grant permission to interrupt proceedings, and influence does not excuse behavior. He then turned back to Lauren and asked her something far more important than compliance, whether she believed her family name changed the facts. Lauren did not answer. She looked at the phone again, as if it were an anchor. Judge Caprio continued, explaining that courts exist precisely because power must stop somewhere, that the purpose of law is not to punish the powerless, but to restrain the powerful. He reminded her that every parent in the gallery had trusted strangers with their children's safety that morning, and that trust had nearly been shattered. Lauren finally spoke again, her voice sharper now, threaded with panic. She said this would damage the state's image. She said this kind of spectacle was unnecessary. Judge Caprio leaned forward slightly and replied that image is never more important than accountability. He told her that what concerned him most was not the driving alone, but her continued refusal to recognize the gravity of her actions. He explained that mistakes can be addressed, but entitlement resists correction. The courtroom remained silent. Even her attorney did not interrupt this time. Judge Caprio then addressed the record again, not with repetition, but with clarity. The refusal to cooperate, the verbal threats, the attempt to leave, the absence of remorse afterward. Each point reinforced the same conclusion. Lauren Whitmore still believed consequences were negotiable. He asked her whether she had considered what would have happened if that parent had reacted a second later. Lauren looked down. For the first time, she said nothing. The judge paused, allowing the question to remain unanswered, because sometimes silence is the most honest response. Then Judge Caprio made a decision that shifted the direction of the hearing entirely. He informed Lauren that her attempt to involve her husband had introduced a new issue, one concerning interference and contempt. He instructed the bailiff to approach and requested the phone. Lauren hesitated. Her attorney whispered urgently. Judge Caprio repeated the instruction. Slowly, reluctantly, she handed the phone over. The bailiff stepped away, and the sound of his shoes against the floor seemed louder than it should have been. Judge Caprio explained that implied pressure has no place in his courtroom, and if influence was going to be referenced, it would be addressed openly rather than allowed to linger as an unspoken threat. He turned toward the clerk and gave a brief instruction. At that moment, everyone in the room understood what was about to happen.
Judge Frank Caprio did not rush the next moment. He understood that authority doesn't need speed, it needs certainty. The courtroom waited as he looked down briefly, then back up at Lauren Whitmore, whose confidence had now fully unraveled into something brittle and exposed. He explained, calmly and deliberately that when someone attempts to use proximity to power inside a courtroom, the court has a responsibility to remove ambiguity. Influence cannot be implied. It must either be irrelevant or addressed openly. Lauren shifted in her seat, her earlier certainty replaced by visible tension. This was not how she had imagined things unfolding. She had expected interruption, intervention, rescue. Instead, she was being forced to confront the very belief she had relied on. Judge Caprio turned his attention to the clerk and confirmed the next step aloud, making it part of the record. He explained that since Lauren had made her husband's position relevant to her defense, not legally but psychologically, the court would not allow that belief to linger unchecked. He made it clear that this was not about embarrassment or spectacle. It was about clarity. The courtroom needed to understand whether authority outside these walls was being invoked, expected, or denied. Lauren's attorney stood quickly, objecting, suggesting that this approach was unnecessary and potentially prejudicial. Judge Caprio listened, then responded with a single sentence that silenced the room. Uncertainty erodes justice faster than transparency ever could. Lauren finally spoke again, her voice strained now, no longer controlled. She said she didn't mean to interfere. She said she just wanted her husband to be aware of what was happening. Judge Caprio acknowledged the statement, but pointed out that awareness and intervention are not the same thing, and her actions suggested the latter. He asked her directly whether she believed her husband could change the outcome of the case. Lauren hesitated. The pause stretched long enough to be noticed. She didn't answer. Judge Caprio nodded slightly, as if the silence had answered for her. The judge then addressed the courtroom more broadly, reminding everyone present why courts exist in the first place, not to punish status, not to protect it, but to apply the law evenly when emotions, fear, or influence attempt to distort it. He reminded the gallery that this case was not about politics. It was about trust, the trust parents place in strangers to follow the law near their children, and the trust society places in courts to act without fear or favor. Lauren sat motionless now, hands folded tightly, eyes fixed forward. Judge Caprio then gave one final instruction to the clerk, this time slower, more deliberate. He stated clearly that any communication occurring next would be placed on the record, audible to everyone present, and treated as testimony insofar as it related to expectations of influence. The room felt suddenly smaller. Even the attorneys seemed to brace themselves. Lauren's attorney leaned toward her and whispered urgently, but whatever advice he offered arrived too late. The decision had already been made. Judge Caprio looked directly at Lauren one last time before proceeding and said something quietly, almost conversationally, yet heavy with meaning. Courts cannot function if people believe power answers phone calls faster than the law answers conduct. Lauren swallowed hard. The belief that had carried her into the courtroom, that she could always call someone, now felt like a trap closing around her. The clerk prepared to act. The room held its breath. And just before the call was placed, Judge Caprio raised one hand slightly, not to stop the process, but to mark the moment, making it unmistakably clear that whatever came next would not be private, negotiable, or reversible. The clerk completed the connection quietly, efficiently, as though this were any other procedural task, and Judge Frank Caprio made one thing unmistakably clear before a single word was spoken on the line. This was not a negotiation, not a request for favor, and not a conversation about status. It was simply a moment of truth, placed into the open where it belonged. When the voice on the other end finally came through, steady and restrained, Judge Caprio identified himself and explained why the call was being made part of the record. There was no accusation in his tone, only clarity. He outlined the situation briefly, not theatrically, not emotionally, but plainly enough that nothing could be misunderstood. The silence that followed felt intentional, as though the weight of the facts required space before a response could exist. When the governor spoke, his words surprised nearly everyone in the room, including Lauren Whitmore. He did not argue, he did not object, he did not ask for leniency. Instead, he acknowledged the seriousness of what had occurred and stated, clearly and without qualification, that the court should proceed exactly as it would for any other defendant. He said that no position, including his own, altered the responsibility that came with placing lives at risk. Lauren stared ahead, frozen, as the belief she had relied on dissolved in real time. Judge Caprio asked a single follow-up question, whether the governor expected special consideration because of who he was. The answer was immediate, no. The law, he said, either applied to everyone or it meant nothing. Judge Caprio thanked him and ended the call without ceremony. There was no applause, no reaction, just a quiet shift in the room as reality settled into place. He turned back to Lauren Whitmore, whose posture had changed completely. The confidence that had carried her into the courtroom was gone, replaced by something smaller, more fragile. Judge Caprio spoke to her calmly, explaining that the court would now do exactly what had been requested, apply the law evenly, without influence, without fear, without exception. He outlined the consequences methodically, each tied directly to a decision she had made. Penalties, restrictions, required accountability, not as punishment for who she was, but as consequence for what she had done. Lauren's attorney objected, but the objection carried no force. Judge Caprio responded that proportionality had already been considered, and fairness did not mean comfort. As the proceedings concluded, Lauren was guided from the courtroom. She passed the parents seated behind her, people whose lives she had nearly altered forever, and for a moment it seemed she might stop. She didn't. One of the parents stood and thanked the judge, not for severity, but for clarity. Judge Caprio nodded and said something simple, something that carried more weight than a lecture ever could. Children are never collateral. In the days that followed, the story spread, not because of spectacle, but because of principle. The governor publicly reaffirmed his support for the court's handling of the case, and later stepped away from public office, citing the need to act consistently with the values he had long spoken about. Lauren Whitmore completed every requirement placed before her. Slowly, uncomfortably, she began to understand the magnitude of what she had almost done. Accountability arrived not as humiliation, but as reckoning, and Judge Caprio returned to the bench the next morning, as he always did, ready for the next case, the next reminder, the next moment when someone would learn that power does not travel farther than the law allows. Because in that courtroom, the rules were simple. No phone call outruns responsibility. No title outweighs consequence. And justice, when done properly, does not need to raise its voice to be heard.